Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to Couch Conversations with the Doctors, where health is wealth. Welcome, welcome. It's Monday night, and what time is it? It's time for Couch Conversation. So, as always, we're going to go around our esteemed table and we're going to introduce all of our guests that are here with us on this evening. And as always, we're going to allow the community to lead the conversation. Starting with that man who's the art connoisseur, that's our very own Joseph Harrington. Joe Harrington, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Well, thank you, Nikki, and thank Congressman Davis as well for providing this platform. My name is Joe Harrington. Most of my career was spent in public health and healthcare. I retired in 2017 from the Illinois Department of Public Health, where I was the regional health officer for Cook County.
Awesome, and thank you so very much. To my colleague who leaves me to go to have fun in the sun, but actually, I think he's hanging out in Chicago. That's our very own Dr. Douglas Graham. Dr. Graham.
Hey, Nikki, I just hung up my raincoat. I'm back. I spent 30 years working in the western suburbs as a physician, retired, and then spent 2 years with a congressman in his office in Washington, D.C. It was an astonishing experience. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And I'm going to try and answer your questions if I can.
Outstanding, and thank you so very much to the doctor that's known on these streets as Dr. 100, our community physician that gets it done. That's our very own Dr. Maya Green. Dr. Green.
Hello, Nikki. Hello, Congressman. Thank you both for providing the space. Hello to my esteemed colleagues. Excited to talk more about whatever the community wants and get into more community conversations. Let's get it.
Outstanding. And to our very special guest that's here with us on this evening, the one who's a library all on his own, that's our very own Dr. William McDade. Dr. McDade, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone that's here?
Thanks, Nikki. I'm Bill McDade. I'm an anesthesiologist by training, a biophysicist, PhD scientist as well. I was on the faculty at the University of Chicago for about 23 years. And then I went down to New Orleans to try to help to lead the academic mission for the Ochsner Health System down in Louisiana. I spent most of my life trying to improve care on the south side of Chicago, and then I figured the best place to try to fix healthcare is in the south. I was drawn back to Chicago to become the chief for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the accrediting council that governs all of graduate medical education. It's residencies and fellows. It's called the ACGME. And so I've been doing that for the last 4 years now, and it's a great honor to be here with the congressman and with all you. Old friends and new. And in fact, Dr. Maya and I go back over 20 years now. Dr. Harrington, probably the same length of time, and Dr. Graham, I've just met today. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Outstanding. I want to say hey to Dorothy Murray. Dorothy Murphy is here, and she says good evening to everyone. Linda Johnson is here, and she says good evening. I see Phyllis Logan is here with us too. Hey, Phyllis. How are you? Dr. Maria Nanos is here with Green Light Family Services. Thank you, Dr. Nanos, for being here with us. Georgetta Davis is here. I want to say hey to Georgetta Davis. Hey, Georgette, how are you on this day? Thank you for being here. Carl Brinson is here. Thank you, Carl Brinson, the president of the West Side branch of the NAACP. I want to say hello to you. Ashley Warner is here. Ashley is the director over at the Community Engagement for NAMI of Chicago. So thank you so very much. I want to say hey to Linda Johnson, who is here. She says good evening to everyone. To Cherie Smith, who is here, who says good evening to everyone. Hey, Colleen, I see you here from the Legal Aid Foundation. Thank you so much for stopping by and being here with us on today. Hey, John Patterson, who is here with us just as well from DCFS, one of the advocacy monitors there. Thank you for being here with us. To Jean Jennings, who is here. Thank you, Jean Jennings, for stopping by and being here with us. To Tawana Watts, who is here. Want to say hey to you just as well, Tawana. Thank you so very much for being here. And to the man who makes this possible for us each and every Monday night, to the one who teaches us that true health is wealth. That's your real wealth, being healthy. That's our very own Dr. Congressman Danny K. Davis. You're muted, Congressman, or either or maybe I'm having some tech problems. Let me see.
All right, just a second.
Oh, there we go.
I was muted, but now I'm unmuted. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I only say that because I went to Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church yesterday, the church that Reverend Clay Evans developed and spearheaded. And I tell you, I had one great time. Let me tell you, the preacher there, Reverend Sharp, was a combination of Clay Evans and a whole bunch of other folks I have heard. And I just had myself a good time. I mean, it was a great time. As the folks say in the hood, they had some church. I mean, they had some church. But I left there feeling good. And then this morning, Senator Durbin and I had a press conference out with Pastor at the Bright Star, Pastor Chris Harris at the Bright Star Church. And we are reintroducing our trauma informed care legislation that he introduced in the last session of Congress, and I introduced in the last session. It was not passed, but he has already reintroduced his bill, and I will be reintroducing my bill in the House almost momentarily. And so we had a great press conference extolling the virtues of trauma informed care because we experience so much trauma in our society until we're trying to catch up to it. And I certainly want to give a shout out to the family of the young woman, young police officer whose life was taken away, to the individuals in Texas whose lives were taken away. And it's like almost every day there is something going on that traumatizes thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And then just a few minutes ago, Nikki, I was pleased that we were able to meet with the chief executive officers of the Chicago Postal Service, along with all of the police commanders in 3 districts, as well as the postal police and postal inspectors, because mail carriers are being robbed and threatened, and some people not comfortable coming to work in the communities where they live. And it was a great meeting between the heads of these agencies, the Postal Service, and all of these law enforcement persons from the Postal Service itself. So I'm excited, I'm delighted, and I mourn with the rest of us as we mourn. I also mourn a little bit, not a lot, the death of a dear friend of mine, Dr. Leon Dingle, who was a tremendous researcher and grantsman and was able to bring in millions of dollars from the time that I met him at the YMCA college. That's where he was working. YMCA had a 2-year college. And then he left there and went to Rush Medical Center and worked as the Dean of Allied Health before going into his own business. He and I served on several PhD dissertation committees for individuals that we knew. And of course, he served on mine. And so I just sent out to his family, um, you know, our respect for him, um, our association with him. May he rest in peace. And so thank you all very much for being on. And I'm delighted to see Dr. Shafdeen Omua, who also knew
How do you do,
my
sir?
I am good and served as the associate dean at the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois and is an esteemed researcher, um, and a member of the World Health Organization and all of these other things that health professionals do. Thank you all very much, Nick. We will move ahead.
So want to say hi to Cherie Smith, who's here. Cherie says, I love you, Danny Davis. Yolanda Williams is here with us as well. And she says, good evening to everyone. She's saying good evening to everyone. And Mary Ballinger is here and she's saying good evening to you all as we begin to get started. Maya, I know that you had a few questions for Dr. McDade. Why don't you go right ahead?
I did, Nikki. I'm definitely gonna ask the questions, but y'all gonna stop bringing these people on this thing. Y'all don't want to hear my story about Dr. Amuwo. Dr. Amuwo, it's Maya.
Hey, I'm here.
When people raise you, okay. I'm gonna get to the questions, Nikki. I just want to give a small shout out. I was thinking when Dr. McDade was here, and Dr. McDade said, he knows me from 20 years back. My first reaction was gonna be like, Dr. McDade, I'm only here telling people I'm in my 20s. What are you talking about? You know? Then I realized I was gonna say, oh, Dr. McDade was one of the physicians that I looked up to when I was in medical school. It just seemed so far away from me to be a doctor. And then I was like, oh, and then Joseph Harrington, when I was just starting in my fellowship, Dr. Romina Key put me in this group called PCORI, and I learned a lot of stuff about how healthcare works. I don't know if you remember that, Mr. Harrington. We never even talked about that. And I learned a lot from you. Then y'all put on here Dr. Amuwo. Okay, I'm gonna tell my story, then I'm gonna leave. I studied for the MCAT. Study at Starbucks. I know we gotta go, Nikki, but I just want people to know how, if you're dedicated and you align yourself with your purpose, blessings will come from places you don't even know. I would study at Starbucks. I would get there early. They'd let me in early eventually. And I would sit there till they closed and I would study, getting ready for the MCAT to prepare. And I went and took the MCAT, got accepted to all my schools. And the one I wanted to go to, because my dad had passed that year and I didn't want to leave Chicago, and I'm a public school person. I mean, so private schools are great. I just know my personality thrives in certain environments. And I was in line to thank the people at Starbucks who let me study. And there was a person behind me. He was, moving, shifting side to side, and I can tell he's ready to go. So I get to the front and I turn around. I say, sir, you can get in front of me. And he said, well, what do you mean I can get in front of you? I said, you can get in front of me because I'm not here to buy anything. And he was like, then why are you in line? And I said, I studied for the MCAT. So I just want to tell the front desk, the cashiers, thank you for letting me study. And then he said, you studied for the MCAT? And I said, yeah. He said, are you going to medical school? I said, yeah. He said, are you going to UIC? And I said, no, because UIC was the one school that wanted me to do a program before I got in. The rest of them, I just got in. And I was like, no, I'm not doing it. And then he was like, well, if you choose UIC, I'll support you to get a master's in public health. And I'll tell you how to do it. Y'all know that man standing behind me in Starbucks that I just turned around and said, you can get in front of me, was Dr. Amuwo. And so Dr. Amuwo, again, I know you got to hear that story every time you see me, but if you were a blessing to me, I know you were a blessing to so many other people. So thank you. Now,
Well, thank you, Maya.
Tell me.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. we need to keep helping others.
Yep. So thank you for that. Dr. McDade, who encouraged us when I was in SNMA, the Student National Medical Association, and stuff was rough. We were running to Dr. McDade, who always had a very, for lack of a better word, royal way about himself, a kingship about himself. And then when you talk to him, he's like super approachable. So it's a question of how well, and very knowledgeable. So it's a question of how much you know and how much confidence you have in yourself. And so thank you for always encouraging us to be confident in ourselves and to be committed to being the most knowledgeable person in the room anywhere we go and preparing. So Dr. McDade, I do want to ask, in the work you do, we connected a couple of weeks ago, and you were telling me more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in medicine, and how that looks and how that benefits patients on the other end after school, after residency, and how patient outcomes actually are affected by who goes to school, who comes out of school, who completes residency, and who's sitting in the office with you. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, first of all, Dr. 100, I'm very proud of you. I'm glad that you made it through your education, and with Dr. Muo's help, and your public health training as well. So you are 100% the reason that I think we do all this. And that really gets to your question. If you look at data from over the last 20 years at the ACGME and of American medicine, we're not training but a small percentage of individuals, about 4.9% are African American in medicine. And that's been that way, like I said, the last 17 years or so. And the numbers haven't really increased very much. And you say to yourself, well, where does that come from? And so I want to reflect back to a report that was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and the American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education. And it's called the Flexner Report, published in 1910. And when Abraham Flexner, who was an educator by trade, published that finding, it was on the quality of medical education across the country, because there were a number of proprietary schools. There were a number of schools that were basically apprenticeships. And then there were a few schools that were based on the European model of education, Johns Hopkins being the foremost emblematic institution in that way. And so the idea of the 2+2 system, where we go 2 years in basic science and 2 years in clinical science, came from that model and was endorsed and advanced by the Flexner Report. Well, that was written over 110 years ago now, and it formed the foundation of how we train people in medicine in this country. Well, in chapter 14 of that report, there was a chapter called The Medical Education of the Negro. And it really spoke to why, of the medical schools, there were 155 medical schools that were open at that time, only 7 of them actually were for historically African-American people. And at the end of his report, he suggested that all but 2 be closed of those 7 medical schools that trained African-Americans. And the idea behind that is the quality was so poor, the educational value was so low, that they were better off being closed than to be reformed. Now, there were a number of other schools that actually went by the same death. Only about 90 schools total made it through the Flexner Report, but 2 of them were Howard and Meharry. And Howard and Meharry are 2 of the 4 historically Black campuses in medicine in the country today. When I was a first-year medical student in 1980, 50% of all Black doctors in this country graduated from either Howard or Meharry. And Howard and Meharry still play an extraordinarily important role in the training of African-American physicians in this country. But what he put in chapter 14 was that there were 60 million whites and 10 million Blacks in the country at the time, and that the 10 million Blacks were not going to be cared for by white physicians. And so we had to keep those 2 medical schools open to produce Negro physicians to care for that 10 million African-American population there Otherwise, they would represent a significant contagion for the other 60 million of the Americans that existed at that time. And the idea that racially concordant care, that is the same race between physician and patient, exists is followed out through the data that you can look at even today, where on average, your likelihood or your odds ratio of being cared for by a Black physician, if you're a Black patient, is about 24 times the greater than your chances of being taken care of by a white physician. If you're an Asian physician, it's about 26 times. If you're a Latinx patient, compared to a white physician, you're more likely to be cared for by a Latinx patient by about 19 times. And the idea that this racially concordant care is how we actually live in America is backed up by the fact that most people seek care in their own communities. They don't go outside their own communities because of issues of trust. They don't actually see practitioners of a different race, even when they're in the same practice. There was a very interesting study published in dentistry that suggested that when there's a mixed practice of dentists, that the African American patients tend to gravitate to the African American dentists in that particular study. And the most compelling one was done by a couple of colleagues of mine. One, Marcella Alsan, who used to be at Loyola here in Chicago, who's now went to Stanford and then went to Harvard, a family medicine doctor and an economist. And she published a paper back in 2018 with Owen Garrick, a colleague of mine in Oakland. And they actually took African-American men and randomized them to a Black physician practice and a white physician practice. And what they found is that when the Black patients saw the Black doctors in the Black physician practice, that they were more likely to talk about a wider range of their clinical problems. They actually wrote longer notes about the patients. And that if you did some very elegant mathematics that they did in that paper, it was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research, that you could reduce cardiovascular morbidity, the sickness from cardiovascular disease, by 19%. And you could reduce cardiovascular mortality, death from heart disease, by 9%, simply by having a concordant relationship between patient and physician. That people practice disproportionately in communities, that they increase trust, that they increase communication, they increase perceived shared worldview, has been shown by a number of different researchers who studied the phenomenon over the years. It's not just patient-centered care, but it is actually the concordance of race that really plays a role. Most recently, during the COVID epidemic, Marcella Alsan and another colleague, Fatima Cody Stanford, actually published a paper looking at whether patients get information differently from physicians based on race, and found out when you showed Black audience, a Black physician, an Asian physician, a white physician, a Latino physician, speaking to them about COVID, that the Black patients were more prone to gain more, that is, test better on the post-exam if the message were delivered by a Black physician. And they were also encouraged to increase the amount of information they learned subsequent to that presentation if the Black physician delivered the message. This is how we trust in American society. This is really the way that our health system has been structured to a large extent. And this is why race still matters in the delivery of care in the United States.
Wow, Dr. McDade. That's a lot. That's a lot, you know, and it speaks to not only healthcare, but so many other aspects of how we live our lives in this country. Now, tell me, to get into medicine, so we're talking on the other side, right? Have you seen within like medical school, residency, things like that, if there are people out here listening and they want to help or think about how they can lift up or parts they can play in impacting how many Black doctors come out on the other side and are available to our communities, what are some of the things we need to think about? What are some of the areas we need to look into? Is it education? Is it financial support for people? I know different organizations like Cook County Physicians Association give scholarships. So many other places give scholarships. What should we look at if we want to help?
Well, I mean, I would argue that my colleague Daniel Dawes, who's now down at Meharry's Health Equity Center, published a book called The Political Determinants of Health. And I would say that I would give Daniel's admonition that we have to vote. You know, I think the Supreme Court is getting ready to deal us a hand that you could never possibly want to have dealt with respect to higher education in general. They're dealing with a case called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and versus University of North Carolina, a private school and a public school. And they're about to remove the ability to use race as a factor for college admissions. This will immediately become the law of the land for medical school admissions. And then some people are even arguing that for resident selection, that may actually play a role in the future. And so if you think about what happened in the 1990s when Proposition 209 was passed in California, Initiative 200 in Washington, propositions all over the country led by this African American gentleman named Ward Connerly, who was a regent at the University of California system at the time. The number of people who applied for college who were Black and brown, indigenous, dramatically dropped. And it never recovered. It went back up again after the nadir when Proposition 209 in California was passed, but never got to those pre 1996 levels because people just didn't think they had a chance and didn't apply. The same thing happened down the Fifth Circuit in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, where people stopped applying. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest barriers that's about to be delivered to us by the Supreme Court. Now, if you ask me in general what the problem is that we have misfunded primary and secondary education. That is, we live in a system that is based in racism that restricted where one could live and where one could get loans and where one could get insurance by this practice called redlining. And we still use a local property-based system in Illinois and many places around the country for funding education. And by basing the educational funding on the local community, as opposed to having statewide pools of funds where there's funds per student that are distributed to those areas, I think we continue to perpetuate a system based in racism that has led to disparate outcomes in education. Preparing people to do well in college starts in grade school. And so when you have people who have to go through college in order to get to medical school, their preparation and success very early on in academics is really central to that particular goal. And I think that's the biggest problem. We don't have enough people on the pathway into medicine. If we had, I think we'd be in much better shape of bringing people through medical school and into those residencies where they can then go out and serve the public.
And then, so it sounds like if I live in an area where there are more finances, where people have more finances to put into education through taxes or whatever kind of system they set up with, they're set up with, the education process or system has more resources versus kind of a neighborhood where the average person makes less money and there's less money to put into the education system. Is that basically?
That's 100, doctor.
Okay, then I know I was gonna go to Mr. Harrington because I remember on Picori there were some talks about even in the research and even when we kind of wanted to look into things like this. I remember so many times you would be like, well, wait a minute, let's make sure we're at the decision table so that our processes don't kind of come out like that. We come out with more equitable processes. I remember one of the fundamental things that you kind of really advocated for in Picori was that we have representation from all cultures, all communities at the start, before we even started making decisions, before we even started building out processes. So what are your thoughts on
that? Well, I'm gonna start somewhere else, and then I'll go to your question. That the last thing that you asked Dr. McDade about was where people live and the conditions in which they live contribute to the lack of maybe African Americans being able to go into medicine. I think the most important thing to understand is a lot of that is structural. It has nothing to do with African Americans being African American. It has more to do with some historic structural barriers that relegated some groups, and African Americans are a prime example of that, to live in certain areas that were under-resourced and have never been adequately resourced. Even those neighborhoods they moved into that were adequately resourced over time lost the resources and became inadequately resources. And some of that was structural decisions, structural things, you know. And one of the things that people always point to, and I think it really is reminds me of my where I grew up, and I grew up in Woodlawn. And Woodlawn was only integrated as a result of the elimination of restricted covenants. And as many people know, that in Chicago, the law was that if you were black, you can only move. And it was like an unwritten law, but I think there was something on the books about restrictive covenants where black people could live. And it wasn't until the late 1940s, it's actually probably around 1947, 1948 that changed. What's interesting is I grew up in Woodland, like I said, and one of the more famous people that grew up in the neighborhood that I grew up in was Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun. And her father moved into a two flat, actually 2 blocks from where I grew up. Now, they didn't know he was black. And once he got in, they found out he was black.
Mm-hmm.
They said, that's against the law. You can't live here because you're black. And so he went to court to uphold the right for him and his family to live in that neighborhood. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, Illinois State Supreme Court. Illinois State Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city. Then it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that was unfair and illegal and struck down restricted covenants, which allowed black people to openly and freely move into Woodlawn. And that's the neighborhood I grew up in. And growing up early on in Woodlawn, the neighborhood was mixed. By the time I was 10 years old, there were virtually no white people in my neighborhood. And I was wondering, where did all the white people go? I was only 10 years old. When I was in grammar school, the classrooms, I went to Catholic grammar school, classroom was 50-50. By the time I was in 4th grade, there were a few white kids in the classrooms. I didn't know where everybody went. But I'm making a point that a lot of what we see is historic, is structural, and it continues to this day. And you can't expect a group to so-called pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they don't have boots to begin with. And so I just want to make that point, which I think I did, and maybe I made a little bit too long. But to get back to your point about what seems to be a major push, and there is a lot of pushback right now about this whole issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which for some is a new term, but you know that for many of us, this is something that we've been fighting for a while. And that the only way for us to get change and bring about change is to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has a voice at the table, everyone is represented by people that look like them, have similar experience to them, but most importantly, have not lost sight of who they are. Because a lot of times we elect officials that look like us, but they no longer think like us. And they're just looking to move from one position to another. So we really need people that have the best interests of people like themselves moving forward. And I think that's how we'll get to where we need to be in the future.
So I think what you've expressed, Joe, is that all aspects of struggle, that no matter which area you might choose to work on, there is room at the end. I mean, there's room for you to be engaged in helping remove the barriers that have prevented us from having equity when it comes to the numbers of African Americans who get the opportunity to become physicians. And that whichever area you want to work on, it's appropriate and it makes good sense to work on it.
I have a question, Congressman. This is Shafdin. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
How are you, Congressman? How are
Junior,
you,
his
ladies and
camera is
gentlemen?
off.
Can you hear me, Dr. Magditch, Dr. Harrison, as well as Dr. Graham? I'm glad to see all of you again. And Dr. Meyer. I have a question. You know, years ago, I've been out of the system for a few years now, but years ago, I know that what had helped all of us were several pipelines that we developed that will lead people that look like us into medical school, into dentistry, into public health, and many other avenues. Many of these pipelines were essentially funded through NIH to NHLBI through several resources. Very small number, very small amount of money sometimes comes through the system. My gig was part of the UHP. I know, Congressman, you were one of the founders of the UHP, but the focus is a little bit different now. I'm wondering, I was just at the School of Public Health just last week because they established some kind of scholarship under my name. I had to go there to award the scholarship. A pensioner, how much money do I have to put into a scholarship? It's funded by my friends. But the point I'm trying to make is that we no longer have the presence of K through 12 or high school and college level students that have pathways to medicine that we used to have. I was surprised by the number of for Black students, Latino students that I saw in School of Public Health, in medicine and dentistry. What is going on? And these monies were many times provided, uh, Congressman, through your office. Of course, your congressional district has more medical schools than any other school in the country. What is going on now? If I can get some help, I'm out of the system. That's why I don't know much about what's going on.
Well, much of what is going on is what we've heard Dr. McDade talk about. I mean, there are barriers that cause individuals to not be in pursuit, but then there are discrepancies all the way back down to, as Joe talked about, where people live, what they learn at early ages, what they expect to do. Public education for them is not what it should be. And so that's why I said that there are enough problems for us to tackle them no matter what area we choose to work in. I'm saying if you want to try and change what is presented for early childhood education, I'm a big fan of early childhood education because I believe that there are so many children who get left behind very early in life. And there are children who are born behind. There used to be a blues song called Born to Lose, where the person expressed everything that existed he had lost. And then he said to his wife or his girlfriend or his significant other, now I'm losing you. And so, I mean, there are individuals born into situations where they have great potential, but that potential is never developed. Therefore, it's never realized. And so we have to keep working. I mean, we make a little bit of progress, And all of the stories are relevant. I mean, everybody's being, there was no black doctor at all where I grew up. I mean, there was not. The closest black doctor we knew anything about was a Dr. Ish in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was a tremendous guy and established not only a hospital and a clinic called United Friends, but also had an insurance policy that my mother bought. And I remember it cost her $5 a month. And so she was able to be in the United Friends even then. And $5 a month we could scrap up, even though we didn't have much. And she kept it until she died. And she had it when she died. It was a burial policy that Dr. Ish created, and his daughter and daughter-in-law came to Chicago, worked here, and were outstanding social workers working for the Illinois Department of Human Services, I believe, and the City of Chicago's Department of Human Services in the Model Cities program and all of those kinds. So it's across the board.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. I'll try to be quick. Again, I want to provide a brief historical context that the civil rights movement of the 60s led to a significant increase in opportunities for African Americans in terms of education and professional careers moving forward. It also was during the 60s and 70s, probably in the 70s. That's when they started to change some of the laws and the regulations, particularly around welfare. And there was a big initiative, Welfare to Work. And one of the rules in that is that a woman receiving public assistance, unless
Good
someone was her
afternoon. Good
husband,
evening. How are you?
could not live
I'm
in the
good. Wanted to
household with the family,
just want to
which contributed to some degree to the breakup of Black families. And one of the things, and I've said this before, that we don't have the advantage in many instances of generational wealth. That there are a lot of people that are in better positions because each generation provides money for the future generation to do a lot of things they do. We have more people among us, I'm talking about African Americans, that can do that for their children today. But there's still a lot of us, 1/3, 30% of African Americans in this country live in poverty. They're not in a position to pass on anything to those children. And one of the things that I've seen happen over time is we, and part of that again is structural, have lost our way. We have generations now, a current generation of children that have no real direction. And they are pursuing alternative lifestyles in greater numbers than ever before. And that doesn't lend itself to people being interested in careers that involve science, technology, engineering, and math. And they're not learning that because in our schools now, they really are more focused on kids passing tests than they are having critical thinking skill, which allow them to problem solve and figure things out for themselves. So there are a lot of things that have gone on that have kept us in the situation we're in today. And we need to be aware of that, acknowledge that, and do what we can to change that moving forward.
I want to kind of provide a little more perspective from the direction that I presented earlier. I know that time is very short, money is very short. I know that the monies are diverted to all kinds of areas. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I decided to stop giving money to anything, given the amount of money we sent to Ukraine. I said, nobody has to be poor in this country. We send so much money to Ukraine, and we still see a lot of people in the street. It just, poor me, I'm seeing people in the street, and we're sending money to Ukraine. I'm thinking in terms of priority. So if we were supporting a whole lot of students, I believe at one time I had some 4,000 kids, 4,000 of them, and kids in that extensive pipeline that we wrote many things about. And thank you again, Congressman. You cited me on April 1st, 2004, in terms of the efforts we were making in your congressional district to get kids to medicine, public health, and other areas. But we are richer now than we used to be. Why then do we have fewer numbers of kids who are doing what they ought to do to get into health professional schools? Mind you, we know that when these kids get in, they go into some other areas, but the kind of basic education we give them provide opportunity for them to become environmental scientists. Many of them even become lawyers. I have 4 students now that study public health who are now practicing law. They are using their intelligence in sciences to support a lot of poor people who are confronted by environmental situations. Why do we have more money, but we have less involvement of people? Maybe Congressman, you can help me. Maybe all of you colleagues can help me. Again, my good excuse is that I'm no longer in the system, but maybe you guys can educate me. I don't know why. We have more money now, but we have fewer people. Can I get some help on this?
Well, I think the politics always take place, and what we have right now is even the progress that we have made. There are lawmakers proposing that some of the people who are receiving medical assistance through Medicaid ought to be made to work. That those individuals are getting, we call it support, they call it welfare, and that anybody receiving welfare, and that's a lot of different categories, that these individuals should be forced and must be forced to actually work. So the real deal is that while some parts of us say, let's go forward, there are others who say, let's go backwards. And there are others who are saying, because sometimes at the federal level, we've been able to enact policies that state levels reject. And so they're trying to shift the opportunity. They call it states' rights. And the only way, to change this is to continue. Like, I am amazed at the large number of people in our communities who do not vote. I mean, we talk about voting and say, oh my God, we had 35%. Well, what happened to the 65% who did not vote, who did not feel that the systems in place merited their effort to just go vote? It only takes, 5 minutes. It's down to where you can write in your vote, send in your vote, and we don't decry those who did vote. And sometimes voting gives us this, but it can't just be where we are. We also have to be strategic. I mean, I was very pleased to have a fundraiser for the senatorial candidates in Georgia. And when they won, oh my God, it was like we had won here in Chicago. And we had one. And every time I'm in the company of people from Georgia, I find some way to say, oh my God, we thank you guys so much because you freed the rest of us. And if you didn't elect those two guys to the Senate, we never ever would have been able to enact the tremendous laws that we did the last 2 and 3 years. It never would have happened. It just never would have happened because we wouldn't have had. The system in many ways is unfair, but we also have to figure out how to make the greatest use of the system that is in place while we try and change it at the same time. I think we need to change the way we elect presidents. I think there was a time when the Electoral College served a certain kind of purpose for minority states and small states. Now, I think it's just the opposite. It seriously helped minority voters to be in charge, basically, of electing the president. And so you can be president of the United States, but you didn't get the most votes. But you can be president. I think that's unfair. I think people need to really understand it and know how it works so they can formulate not only their opinion to change it. I mean, how do you get several thousand votes, 100,000 votes more than the other guy, and the other guy become president? And we say every vote counts. One person, one vote. So I think that we have to keep struggling every way we can possibly struggle and keep teaching our children every way that we can teach them that freedom ain't free.
I think, I think another part of it is, and I think somebody alluded to it, we have to get involved, find out what legislators are doing, and support our legislators. I said, I don't know how many times I've heard me say this. We have to support legislators that support us. If they don't support us, then we need to make a change. But we have to support our legislators and uphold them. The other thing is, the way we've heard it so many times, the way things are built, all the way from when a person is born, early education, primary education, secondary education, medical, getting into medical school, college, getting into medical school and residency, things like that. There are systems set up in a certain way that a lot of times don't support our youth matriculating. So the only way we can kind of undo that is to wake up every day and going back to what Dr. Omuo did, infuse equity into every level of that person's experience, right? When you at the Starbucks, ask the person in front of them if they say they're going to get an MD, be like, great, guess what? Surprise, you're getting an MPH too. And so that set me up for a lot of, and I was just in Starbucks saying thank you. The MPH set me up for a lot of public health, opened the world I hadn't even thought about coming from Roseland, and it set me up for a lot of the things I'm able to do now. Just in Starbucks, somebody infused equity into my life. Have you thought about an MPH? No, I don't even know what that is. But guess what? If you go here, I'll tell you what it is, and I'll help you get one. And then make space. Dr. Graham, I know you also worked and have done some work to increase the number of health centers and residencies that let in or accept and service underserved populations. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the problems we have with our educational system is people tend to want to work where they're trained. Most of the training places are in large urban areas. And one of the biggest problems is most of the new medical schools have are virtually all Caucasian residents and medical students. We know that in teaching health centers, which are generally based in places that are underserved or under resourced, are the most effective ways of training physicians to then want to work in that community. And if you want to look for a return on your investment, you want to speak economic terms, it's probably your best bang for the buck in terms of training people who take care of people and then reduce healthcare costs. And the idea was not just to increase the number of medical residents, but also some of the ancillary other people as well, mental health specialists, dentists, physical therapists, so that we'll be able to have people who are working in the communities that need help and stay there when they're completing their training. We have the public health service, but unfortunately, it's kind of like you spend a couple of years there, 4 or 5 years there, and after your time is up, people leave, and then you have to start all over again. So to really have continuity of care, you want to train everybody in the communities where they're going to work in the future.
I think these are very important. Thank you, Dr. Graham. Is that Dort? Is that the Nikki? You gonna stop putting these on this?
Well, quickly I want to make sure that we let you know that Mary Ballinger says, "Great story, Dr. Maya." I think that's when you were telling about the blessing that Dr.
How are you, Honorable Brown? This is Shafteen.
I think they were talking about the great blessing you were sharing that Dr. Amua had assisted you with. She also says, great acknowledgments. Tarina is here. Newkirk Sutton, that is, says, good evening to everyone and gives a great smile. Jack Lynch says he will be here next week with us. Great team. He says, good evening to his team, but he's going to be here on next week. And we're going to make sure we have space for you too, Jack Lynch. Curtis Jones is here and he says, good evening to everyone. Bonnie Schmetley is here. That's Sister Schmetley. She says, great. Thanks. That's good. Dorothy Murray is here and she says, it's National Nurses Week. Nurses play a key role in health in our community. And she's absolutely right. It's National Nurses Week. Betty Johnson is here and she says, hey to everyone that's here. Mary Ballinger says, very interesting facts and inside information. And of course, Audrey Jaycox is here and she says, good evening just as well. Well, I know you guys hate to hear me say this. I know you do. But what I have to say is it's our time. But right before we do our Until Next Mondays, and Dr. McDade, you have to come back. You have to come back and be with us again. But right before we do our Until Next Mondays, got a few announcements that we want to make. First of all, I want to make an announcement for Wednesday, May 10th. That's Wednesday, May 10th. The Urban Transformation Network and its Climate Agu Health Expo will be held at the JLM Center. This is supported by Congressman Danny K. Davis. Of course, you know health is wealth. We're going to be at the JLM Center at 2622 West on Jackson Street. There's going to be agriculture, health screening, fitness, food choices, nutrition, and so much more. So meet us for those health screenings right at the JLM Center, 2622 West Jackson, on Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And of course, we have the Honorable former clerk of Cook County, Attorney Dorothy Brown, Cook that is, that's here with us on this evening with another outstanding announcement of something that her and Congressman Davis is doing together.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And good to see everyone. And my announcement is about health also. On Saturday, July 8th, Congressman Davis and the Urban Transformation Network is co-hosting an event at the United Center. And it's going to be a citywide climate smart agricultural equity expo extravaganza. It's going to be a health fair, and we're going to have a walk, ride, bike-a-thon will be pre-expo. That's going to start at 8 o'clock. It's all about health, guys. We're going to have a youth pavilion to talk about health to young people, a senior pavilion to talk about health to seniors, the urban gardening pavilion for the Urban Transformation Network to talk about food as a prescription or as medicine, food as medicine. And also there'll be cooking demonstrations of actually cooking healthy. There will be a government pavilion, so come on out. We'll have government organizations providing various services. a health and spiritual healing pavilion, and a health and the disabled pavilion. We're inviting a lot of elected officials. We're asking Congressman Davis to even invite Vice President Kamala Harris. We want our former First Lady Michelle Obama to come to talk about her initiatives. And then I know she has a new health drink. And then the USDA secretary, we're inviting him. We're inviting the governor, the lieutenant governor, who actually handles the urban agriculture gardening for the state. We're inviting the USDA here in Chicago. We're inviting the board president, the mayor-elect Brandon Johnson, all the state reps. This is citywide, so state reps representing the various communities that are affected by food deserts and the like. State senators, aldermen, we're inviting all of them, and we are supported by various partners, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Shared Aquarium, CPS, the Lighthouse for the Blind, and various organizations that are working with us. This is going to be huge. We want all of you to come. And just to add to the event that Nikki just talked about on Wednesday, we're going to actually also have a live heart surgery that we're partnering with the Museum of Science and Industry. There's a live heart surgery that the Advocate in Oak Park has a surgery every Wednesday, and they permit people to zoom in and see that heart surgery and learn about what this individual could have done, how they could have eaten more healthy in order to not have to have this heart surgery. So it's actually a teaching, it's a lesson in health, but coming from a standpoint of what you should do not to have a heart surgery. So that's going to start at 9 o'clock on Wednesday as well. So we want everyone to come. It's a long surgery, usually lasts from 9 to noon. So you can come in at any time and actually witness someone actually getting an open heart surgery operation.
Wow.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for sharing that. Well, we're going to go around our esteemed panel and do our Until Next Mondays. So, Joe, I'm going to start with you. What do you want our viewers to hear, know, and remember until next Monday? You're muted, Joe. Joe, it's muted. There you go.
I'm not. There I go. Okay. Yeah, I have a number of things. For my dear brother, Shaftin Amua, because I do consider him a brother, I want to say to him, Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
He knows it. Yes, he knows what that means. I also want to
Thank
share
God.
a quote. Thank you. I also want to share a quote, at least a portion of a quote from Eric Greitens. No one escapes pain, fear, and suffering. Yet from pain can come wisdom. From fear can come courage. From suffering can come strength. And what I want to add to that is tough times don't last, but tough people do. And the last thing is, it is National Nurses Week. National Nurses Day is Wednesday. So if you know a nurse, wish her a happy National Nurses Day. And also, lastly, the Chicago Chapter National Allied Nurses Association is celebrating their 50th anniversary this year, and there's going to be a big anniversary celebration later this year, and I'm sure we'll share information with people moving forward. That's
outstanding, and thank you so very
Thank
much,
you, Joe.
Doug. You're until next Monday.
I just want to build on what Dr. 100 said. In order to have the health professionals that you're looking for, you need both the education and the opportunities. And from my perspective, it's your legislator who's the guardian of both. So you got to know what they think and believe, what they're working on, and support the ones who are going to help you get those education opportunities.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Dr. Amua, what would you like to share with all of our viewers until next Monday?
Well, no excuses for me this time. I just would like us to revisit many things we used to do, because we know we have this kind of discussions all the time. I'm very grateful to the congressman that always guides us to make sure that we come back to basic, to have an understanding in such a way that we'll be able to support our community. And so I'm looking forward to participating more and be able to educate our people how they can support our people.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Dr. McDade, you're until next Monday.
Well, I just want to encourage Congressman Davis to hold fast into the important principles around diversity, equity, inclusion, and their impact in healthcare. Just this week, we learned that there's a congressional hearing where the commission that credits medical schools was called into question because of its standards that require diversity, equity, inclusion in medical schools. And so that it's under attack in many of the states. 34 different pieces of legislation in 17 different states attacking DEI. This is a war. What I told you about the Flexner report, had those other five medical schools been open, there'd be 35,000 more Black physicians who would have been in this country. And all those individuals who didn't have access to care, didn't have access to the concordant relationships we talked about, could have been around a little bit longer had they had those physicians. So it's an attack, and we have to make sure that we're there to fight back. And Congressman, you please stand up to those folks who are giving us a hard time around the country.
Outstanding, and thank you. Dr. 100, you're until next Monday.
Well, I mentioned Dr. McDade, Mr. Harrington, Dr. Rule. Then you start talking about the urban health program, and I'm a product of the urban health program. So Congressman Davis also played a part in it. And but here's the thing, I'm a product of so many environments. I also bring with me my Roseland experience, my life experience, everything, and that benefits the patient also. You know, I remember on one of my interviews, they were talking about I grew up in Roseland and all this other stuff, and comparing me to themselves. And he was telling me he had the Science Museum the Science Magazine since he was 15, and wondering what I had to offer, and why I thought I should be a doctor. And I mentioned I bring to the table my life experiences, which serve so many people in the community. And it was at UIC when I had that question asked. So many people in the community around there that you want to serve, right? There are things that you're not going to get to in 15 minutes. I already understand them, and so the patients are going to be more likely to go to that next level. And that's what healthcare is about. Finding a person where they are and joining them and supporting them on their journey. And so thank you all for creating a space for me to do that. I also hope if anybody's listening, these are the conversations we need to continue to have in order to lift up our community. So join us next Monday, but also have somebody else join us, because the more conversation we have, the more solutions are going to come from within our community. Never in history has a answer for a problem that bothered a community come from outside that community. So I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. Invite somebody else. Let's continue and move from this equity talk, which we're doing, right, to more equity action.
Thank you.
And well, the congressman has been froze for a little while, and I'm wondering if he is still frozen through technical difficulties on that side that we've been working on the back
you
side.
just don't see
So,
me,
Congressman,
but
can you hear?
Yeah,
Oh,
I am
okay.
here.
Well, Congressman, take us home.
Yeah, we have a little shot of difficulty with our technology, but I am here. I have heard everybody. I have heard everything. I want to thank all of you for your participation. I also want to thank Dr. Carol Adams. I've been reading her book. That's all she wrote, and that's all I've been reading. And it's a wonderful, wonderful reflection and remembrances by Dr. Adams. Anybody that have not read it, I
Oh,
would.
I've read it. I read it.
Some people have read it. Joe is an avid reader. For those who may not have, I urge that you get a copy. This has been so profound. I don't know that I've ever heard an explanation of the Flexner report, the Flexner study that devastated the opportunity for African Americans to attend African American developed medical schools because most of them, of course, didn't meet the qualifications. And I thought of the fact that there are people right now trying to ban certain books so that people can't read those that in many ways reflect and tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth about America. And we're going to read them anyway. We're going to teach from them anyway. And so we're going to keep coming anyway, notwithstanding all of the efforts to prevent it. And so this discussion has generated thoughts in my mind. I am going to make one announcement. We don't do politics on this show, but lots of folks have been asking me if I was going to run for office again. And my answer to it, we let it be known earlier today that yes, there is so much work to be done. There are so many things to do until I am going to submit myself to the voters of the 7th District and run for re-election. And so that's not the official announcement, but is just to answer those individuals who have been asking me. We've made progress. We've experienced some good things. But I recall one philosopher who said that freedom is a hard-won thing. Each generation have to win it and win it again. And so it never stops in terms of this quest for equity, equal opportunity, equal treatment, equal protection under the law, equal treatment by our judicial system. Freedom is a hard-won thing. Every generation have to win it and win it again. Finding equity, creating equity, to be treated the same, have the same opportunities as others, is the basic desire, a basic desire of all human beings on our earth. And such is true for Africans in America. The struggle must continue, a luta continue, and we will conquer without a doubt. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you, sir.
Washington in the morning.
Thank you, sir.
All righty. It's
Good
been my
night.
good night.
Good night.
And next week
Good
won't
night.
happen to my internet. It would be working